Alrighty, thank you. So for those of you from Victoria, South Australia, I'll just introduce you to the wonderful game of rugby league. And the reason I put that up there is, at the moment, particularly in the recycling industry, it can feel a little bit like recyclers are in the bottom of that gang tackle there. You've got the China national sword, other waste bans, market issues, fire issues, and last but not least, the issue of asbestos, all causing serious headaches and difficulties in the industry. So what I'm talking about today is the regulation of asbestos and the difficulties we have. And just in case you thought you wandered into a presentation on graphic design, let me disabuse you of that notion. But the point of that picture is to illustrate that when we have regulation, when we have laws, guidelines, regulations made, it's not a perfect world. You have on the one side industry saying we need more practical regulation, we need to be able to do what we do, more permissive standards. You have science that says, well, here's statistics, here's the risks, here's what have you. But then on the other hand, you have one dodgy waste dump a truckload of asbestos next to a kindy, and all that can go out the window because you have the entire community screaming and, outrage and panic and what have you. And that all kind of feeds into the political process where laws, regulations are made, etc. So you end up with this balancing act. And asbestos is particularly prone to that sort of tug of war between the different factors. So how's it regulated? Most states, talking Queensland, Victoria, South Australia, have fairly similar regulation of asbestos waste. And the headline is a lot of it is regulated by OH&S rather than as a waste-specific issue. But what you do have, common to all states, is regulations around what are called controlled or listed wastes. There's a national agreement on that, and that covers asbestos, which I'll talk about. And there are usually specific requirements for facilities dealing with asbestos or disposing of it or transporting it to have a licence to do so. That's broadly what most states have, and they might have a couple of restrictions on transport and disposal of either C&I waste containing asbestos or waste containing asbestos more generally. So the transport, there's a national environment protection measure, a national agreed standard in terms of interstate transportation of waste. And that's what most states have given effect to in transport. And that just refers to asbestos. Doesn't say how much asbestos in waste, doesn't say particular thresholds, doesn't give any guidance, just says asbestos. So what does that mean? And in most states have then just given that literal effect and in their own regulations just said asbestos. And so the question becomes, well, if you've got 50 tonne and you find one fleck of asbestos, does that mean the truckload's asbestos? Does that mean it's all now regulated asbestos? Can you separate? Can you mix? And that's the current answer. For those of you out there with kids or who tweet a lot, you'll know what that means. And it's a little bit, unsatisfactory, but that's the reality. By the way, if your lawyer gives this to you in their advice, for the record, I've never done that in an advice to a client, but you should probably be looking elsewhere. So I won't go through the states specifically because of time, but they all broadly run along those themes. But if you download the slides later, you'll be able to find these. But they're all generally along these lines. A couple have a few thresholds for very specific issues, but broadly the same restrictions on transport referring to asbestos, some specific to C&I waste only, some more broadly, similar licensing requirements for facilities dealing and people dealing with asbestos. Then we come to New South Wales, and for some reason New South Wales always has to be different and stricter. So New South Wales, we have offences which, in fairness, other states have about unlawfully disposing of waste at a place that can't receive it, unlawfully transporting it to a place that can't receive it, not having a licence when you need one, or breaching licence conditions. But they particularly bite in New South Wales for reasons I'll explain in a minute. We also have what is, I believe, unique to New South Wales specific offences related to asbestos waste, which I'll go through in a moment. We also have it deemed to be pollution if there's more than 10 tonnes of waste applied to land. And then we have that same National Environment Protection measure about transportation, common to the other states. So critical then in understanding all these offences, all these requirements, provisions in New South Wales is the definition of asbestos waste. So in fairness to New South Wales, they've had a crack, come up with the term asbestos waste, which some other states haven't. But the definition leaves a little bit to be desired. It just says any waste that contains asbestos. Cool. And this is really critical because this is in the POEO Act, the Primary Environmental Act relating to waste. It's reflected also in the waste classification guidelines in New South Wales. And think about it, for a facility, knowing, if they can't receive asbestos waste on their licence, you need to classify and work out whether or not it's asbestos waste. For transporters, etc., it feeds through into all aspects this definition of asbestos waste. So the question is, with this definition, how much asbestos waste? What if you've got a 50-tonne stockpile and there's one microscopic fleck? Is that entire stockpile asbestos waste? What if you're at a MRF and that MRF, it happens when you're dealing with C&D waste is a little bit of asbestos might slip through all the visual inspections, the tip and inspect, all of that stuff, end up in the trummels and everything and just contaminate the streams. And so if you go around any MRF and test, you'll find 0.00 something asbestos. In fact, if you go around this room, you'll probably find 0.00 something % of asbestos. That's just the reality. So does that mean our entire stockpile, MRF, truckload becomes asbestos waste and is regulated as such? This guy again. There is no clear guidance. There's no clear rule on the issue. Now, I do have personal views, and there has been a recent case which has touched on it, but it's still a grey area, and that's difficult for industry to deal with. There's also a lot of confusion because we have a different National Environment Protection measure, this one dealing with contaminated land, and that does have specific criteria for asbestos, below which effectively treats it as not harmful to human health if it's in soil, and no further investigation is required. But then, so that's contaminated land, and OH&S has its own requirements, etc. But then you have the waste classification guidelines, which have no thresholds. It's just asbestos waste. And there's a lot of crossover because if you think about it, asbestos is primarily an issue in C&D waste, in soil, in that waste stream, and then you're coming close to contaminated land issues. So there's also a lot of confusion. And the other difficulty, under New South Wales environmental laws, human health is part of the environment. So I've been involved in a number of EPA prosecutions and investigations where there's been absolutely no harm to the environment whatsoever, other than humans being exposed to gases, for example, or potentially or likely exposed. And the EPA has prosecuted them even when work cover's not interested, because that is still technically part of the environment. So you have actually the environmental regulator carrying out what is in effect OH&S prosecutions under environmental laws. So there's a heap of confusion out there in the industry between all of this stuff. So we come to a really interesting case decided late last year, Environment Protection Authority in Graffle. And what happened to Macca's Sand and Soils, Robert McKenzie, I think the name was importing a heap of soil material to his site to build a road. And he had development consent for that, and importantly, it was coming from numerous proper licensed resource recovery facilities that were supplying it under resource recovery orders and exemptions, and it was certified to have done all the testing to meet those specifications. So he was receiving this with all the certificates saying it's all kosher, But EPA carried out an investigation over some time and eventually tested this soil, these stockpiles, and in a few of them, in a few small locations, located asbestos. And they prosecuted for a number of reasons, but basically saying you're unlawfully using this site as a waste facility. Because if you think about it, you got a farm, you got a rural property, there are, under resource recovery exemptions, you're allowed to take soil in certain circumstances and use it, but once it becomes asbestos waste and doesn't fall under, or if it doesn't fall under those exemptions, you need a licence, you need to be a licensed waste facility. So he was prosecuted for that. Lot of things to unpack in this case, but the only thing I'll really deal with here was the asbestos one. So the EPA went for the big win in saying, well, it's all asbestos waste, right? That definition, any waste that contains asbestos. So all of that, all these stockpiles, it's all asbestos waste because we found asbestos. And the judge in that, Justice Payne, she actually disagreed with another Land Environment Court judge from an earlier hearing. So now we've currently got a lack of judicial comity, two judgments that sort of disagree, which makes a bit of uncertainty. But she said, as far as the asbestos goes, she said, look, this is coming from multiple locations, all certified, it's heterogeneous, it's been sitting there for weeks, months, however long, you don't know what's happened to it, you don't know what's gone where, and you found a couple of bits of asbestos. You can't tell me it's all asbestos waste. So she found that the EPA had not proven beyond a reasonable doubt the material was asbestos waste. Now that's different to saying it is definitely not asbestos waste and none of it is, but she said, well, you said it's all asbestos waste and you haven't proven that. So that's shifted the pendulum a bit. There's a bit of an argument now that material might not be asbestos waste, but there's still some grey area for argument. So what does the New South Wales EPA do in response? Does it roll up its sleeve and wade into the very difficult and fraught, in fairness, discussion about how we define asbestos waste? No. What it does is says, okay, you want to have a crack, you want to argue as to whether or not his material is asbestos waste, go for your life, but we are going to use an absolute sledgehammer to crack a nut if you do. And introduced asbestos waste reforms that have massively increased the potential liability involving asbestos waste. So firstly, the existing offences, so unlawful transport, unlawful disposal, etc., are doubled now from $1 to $2 million if they involve asbestos waste. It's also an aggravating factor in sentencing considerations. And two small offences which are in the regulations and had small fines have now been put into the Act with massive fines. You're not waving at me, you're saying 5 minutes? Okay, cool. So those two offences, the thing about them, in the Graffel case, EPA also said, well, you haven't complied with the resource recovery exemption because you received material that has asbestos in it. And Justice Payne dismissed that for a few reasons. Firstly, saying, well, it's not really on the recipient, it's on the person generating it, testing it. They're the one who's responsible. But secondly, she said that, the resource recovery exemptions and orders didn't say you had to test for asbestos. They actually didn't say it. They didn't have it in the chemical assessment and testing criteria. They had a note at the bottom that says, by the way, there's offences for reusing asbestos waste. She said, but that's just a little note. That's advisory telling you what's out there in other legislation. And you didn't bring this prosecution under those regulations. You brought it for a different offence. Tough luck. You know, would she have found for the EPA on those? So the EPA went, all right, well, those little provisions under the regulation have now become massive provisions under the Act. Disposal of asbestos waste at an unlawful site, now $2 million max penalty. Reuse or recycling of asbestos waste, which is a really difficult one for industry, for MRFs to deal with, $2 million maximum penalty. So what does it mean for the industry? So I'll tell you a story. I've got a client operates a MRF, and they are a really good operator. I'm not just saying that because they're my client, but they've set up specific resource recovery streams exactly to meet the requirements of the resource recovery orders, the testing, the sampling. And not only that, but even before all of this, all these reforms, they were doing a pre-inspection for asbestos, and then at the end another inspection for asbestos to make sure there wasn't asbestos, even though it wasn't required, not required at all under that order. To protect their staff primarily for OH&S, to protect their reputation. They don't want to supply bad material. And that clients come and said to me, well, what do we do? Because at some point, we accept C&D waste. This is soil we're dealing with. It's inevitable at some point you're going to end up with small microscopic amounts of asbestos in this material. What do we do? Are we liable? And as I said, it's a real difficult grey area, that liability, and this client is considering just getting out of that resource recovery stream. They've said, well, why do we bother? We're just going to send it to our landfill, basically. Why are we putting ourselves out there? So, I guess the point of all of this, and the problem is, they are carrying out all the due diligence you can expect. They're doing everything you can expect. And that's, for me, I guess, this balancing act I was talking about at the beginning. I certainly support strong regulation of asbestos. I think we all do. It's necessary, and we've got to go after the rogue operators and make sure they can't do the wrong thing. But at the same time, if you need to reward good due diligence, companies with good systems, good procedures, and support responsible resource recovery. And if you go too far, too hard in regulating asbestos, you really risk squeezing the C&D industry to a point where they just say, forget it, why do we bother? We'll send it all to landfill. And I fully accept it's a very tough balancing act for the regulator, but something like a due diligence defence in those sorts of provisions would make a world of difference for good operators. I think Tony from Suez yesterday said the quote, if we are regulated, or in my words, over-regulated, we can't innovate. And I think that's the risk here as well, is if we push too hard and push the balance too far, we'll end up losing out for the entire waste stream. So that's about it from me. We'll do questions at the end, won't we?